Back in my undergraduate days, before rabbinical school, my major was history, and history has been my passion ever since. And anyone who studies history comes to the same conclusion, is that it repeats and repeats and repeats. And when things seem to change, they just revert right back. And time seems to not work in a manner of progress in ways we might hope, but almost more like a pendulum. As it goes one way, it is sure to swing right back the other way. And so is the conclusion derived from the author Kohelet, the author of the book of Ecclesiastes. He expresses this opinion throughout, but no place more eloquently and with such beautiful poetry as in the very first chapter of Ecclesiastes, with words that may be familiar, but certainly the final verse very familiar. It states, "A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises, the sun goes down, and hurries to the place where it rises. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, they continue to flow. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun." So much in our observance, in our own lifetimes, ourselves witnessing history can testify to the veracity of these words and these sentiments. I'm thinking right now of those heady days of 1989, 1990, 1991, with the crashing down of the Berlin Wall, the thawing out of glasnost, and then the crumbling and the dissolution of that evil empire of the Soviet Union. We couldn't believe what we were witnessing. We couldn't imagine, after decades and decades of Cold War and animosity, what was happening and the new dawn and the promise and the exhilaration that we felt at all of these satellite states of Eastern Europe and Central Europe were coming out under the burden of the Soviet, state, and the Russians themselves were free and were holding free elections. Democracy was ruling the day. People were voting and excited about it. And nuclear arms were being dismantled, and lifetime spent worried about war with the Russians was now to be a thing of the past. Alas, so much has come undone and reverting before our very eyes right back to the way it was in the past. That seems to be the normal experience of our human condition here on earth. So something new happening. Something surprising when it actually happens in the world. It takes us aback to think that something could occur that, had you told us before, we would say impossible. And yet, things like this keep happening. A few years ago, the people of Ukraine elected a Jewish prime minister for the first time in their history, and then a couple years later elected the first Jewish president of Ukraine after Jews have been living there for 1,000 years. Before this happened, a century ago, say, we would have thought this to be impossible. But Ukraine of the late 20th century, the early 21st century, is the most warmly embracing state among the Eastern and Central Europe of all of the nations embracing of their Jews and accepting. But if you went back 100 years ago, you wouldn't believe it. Before the Holocaust, the worst, bloodiest, horrific massacres and pogroms happened in the Ukraine, Ukrainians murdering Jews. And then in the Holocaust, Ukraine was among the most notorious of willing participants joining the Nazis in exterminating Jews, most famously but not exclusively at Babi Yar. But now, 80 years later, they have a Jewish president. And not just a Jewish president, but a president who makes all Jews proud and who has become not just a president of Ukraine, but the very face of the nation and the Ukrainian people. He's become the symbol of their will and their fight. And if we told you this 100 years ago would happen, you, I, everyone would say, impossible. In our Torah portion that we just heard, we get the laws of God, and then it says, and Moses faithfully carried out God's will. Moses, the leader of the people. If you had told young Moses that he would be the leader of the Israelites, he would have said, get out of here. Think about where he was. Moses was a refugee expelled out of Egypt. He was living in Midian. He wasn't even near the Israelites. He was married into a Midianite family. He was tending the flocks of his Midianite father-in-law. He was living among the Midianites. The chances that this man would go on to be the leader of the Israelites was highly improbable. In fact, it's its own miracle that he was even alive to do it, escaping the decree of Pharaoh that all the Israelite boys should be killed and floating along the Nile and adopted by Pharaoh's own daughter. That he would be our leader, not to happen until it did. Amazing, unexpected things do sometimes happen. In 2008, a fertilizer salesman in Yorkshire, in northern England, went to bet on the horses one day. There were 8 races, and he chose underdogs. He chose dark horses. He chose long shots. That's the word I was looking for. He chose long shots in all 8 races, and wait for it, made it a parlay. For those of you who don't bet, it means that he doesn't win unless all 8 of his horses win. But if you look at the odds that day, the horses that he chose, the odds of him getting them all right were less than 1 in 2 million. And it remains to this day the single most unlikely winning bet in recorded gambling history in Britain, and they have much better recorded history than we do. But that's also why you shouldn't bet a parlay. But the point is, because these things happen rarely, and if you asked anybody, is that bet going to come in, they'd be say, that's impossible. This topic, the desire to speak about this on this night of Israel Shabbat, actually came to me from an experience that I had about 2-3 weeks ago with our confirmation class on a Sunday morning. So every year the confirmation class chooses their topics for the year, for each session. And this year, as one of their topics, they chose to understand the conflict with the Palestinians. And so in this one wasn't so much a lecture, a discussion, more of a lecture, just about the history of the conflict between, the establishment of the State of Israel and the fighting with the Palestinians and other Arab nations and attempts at peace and the whole history and understanding and the land and what is the West Bank and what is the Gaza Strip and who are the Palestinians and all of these things. And of course, when you talk about this conflict, you can't help but be exasperated at all of the times, 3 most especially, when the Palestinian people were offered a Palestinian state side by side with the Jewish people, and all 3 times they rejected it. How over the last decades, Israel has gone cold to the idea of peace with the Palestinians and not trusting the Palestinians as partners to form the negotiations for peace. And it just seems so hopeless. It's so intractable that it's just seems so close, right, with Oslo in 1993, and yet now we seem farther away than we were the day before Oslo. But in the midst of this discussion, and we're giving the history, and we're talking about Gaza and so forth, and I'm explaining about how that land came into Israel's possession and how that land is, they withdrew from the land and so forth. We talked about Egypt, naturally. And when I talked about, land swaps and negotiating land for peace and so forth, I explained Israel's history of trading land for peace and, Sinai Accords. And then this epiphany occurred to me, to the kids, whatever, they didn't know. But in my mind, I was like, as I'm explaining the peace and the nature of peace and how it's established with Egypt, it occurred to me that these kids have never known Egypt as an enemy. Egypt is Israel's partner. Their peaceable, peace-packed partner, side-by-side, friendly neighbor for their whole life, and they've never known otherwise. I had to explain to them, it wouldn't occur to them that since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, that Egypt rejected, the UN partition plan, told the Palestinians, get out of the way, we're going to drive them into the sea. And then in 1967, Egypt united the whole Arab world to attack and annihilate and destroy and massacre the Israelis. And failed, and then tried again in 1973. This Egypt, they don't know. Because the Egypt now would give you no clue. Egypt now, it's not just, Jordan, we have a peace agreement with Jordan. Jordan, I wouldn't say is a friendly peace. Jordan, we're not at war with Jordan anymore. But Egypt, there's tremendous cooperation, military, intelligence, cooperation, partnership. Everybody talks about, is mad at Israel about closing off the borders of Gaza. It's like, but everyone forgets that Gaza borders two nations, Israel and Egypt. Israel can't do anything to prevent arms shipments into Gaza from Iran without the cooperation of Egypt that controls the southern border of Gaza. They're hand in hand because they have a common enemy of Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood, Muslim extremism, and most especially of Iran. But the point I'm trying to make is this. If you were to tell us 80 years ago, 50 years ago, that this would be Egypt today, Egypt and Israel, we would say impossible. If I told you that your children, your grandchildren in confirmation class would grow up only knowing Egypt as a partner and friend, you couldn't rightfully, no sane person could believe it. And now, the news of the last 2 weeks. Holocaust survivors in the Ukraine are being evacuated and taken to Germany. We'll get to that. So, only a few of them. Let's just put the facts in. There's about 10,000 Holocaust survivors in Ukraine currently. The vast majority of them are staying. About 300 to 500 have gone to Israel just in the last month. But about 80 of them were not well enough for a trip to Israel. They are bedbound, need constant medical attention, and cannot make the trip by flight. And so they are being taken, organized by the Joint Distribution Committee, taken by ambulance across the border and then across another border through Poland into Germany. And 80 of them are residing together in a nursing home in northern Germany. Who could have possibly ever have guessed that Germany would be a refuge for Jews? And dafka, to use the Hebrew phrase, dafka, these Jews, survivors, Holocaust survivors, that their safest refuge in the place that can keep them alive and give them the medical treatment that they need, of all the places on earth, is Germany. Galina Plashenko, 88 years old, Holocaust survivor. When she was a little girl, she went into hiding with her mother. She was in a nursing home on the 3rd floor, and during all of the air raids, the fellow residents and the nurses evacuated into the basement naturally, but she was unable to, so she remains in her 3rd floor room during all of the bombings. JDC came to her, said, "We need to get you out of here." And they told her the best option for her was Germany. And she said, quote, "I hope you're right." And they're right. This whole operation is being run out of JDC in Jerusalem with partners in Germany, going across the borders, relocating. One of the survivors they found, all of the windows of his apartment had been blown out in shelling, and when they came to him, he was shivering. It was 14 degrees in his apartment for who knows how long he was there before they got him out, and now he is 2 doors down from Galina in Germany. Also there is Vladimir Peskov. He is age 87. And when he thinks about the bookends of his life as a child and now again, where he is under attack, he is under threat, and he is on the run and fleeing, he said, quote, "I feel kind of hopeless because it does feel like history repeats itself." But with one change. This time, instead of being saved by the Russians from the German aggressors, he's running from the Russians to the German saviors. And he says, quote, "Today's war has ended any negative emotions I felt towards Germany," end quote. Who could have known? And so I go back to that classroom. We were in the social hall that day. So I go back to the classroom with the kids in confirmation. And we're just laying out all the issues, with the Palestinians and just how hopeless it seems. But what if it's possible? What if it's possible for there to be peace in Israel? Peace with Israel's neighbors like there is with Egypt. Peace with the Palestinians like there is with Egypt. And then I think about Germany and how Germany has transformed. And who can say what isn't possible anymore? And then I think about our Seder just a couple weeks ago, when in that moment, all of us Jews, seasoned Jews, who've been beaten down by time and experience, we all turned and looked at the door as the kids walked up and opened up to the door to Elijah. And in that moment, we all looked. And for one moment, all of us had that same perfect thought. What if? May that peace that seems impossible be possible. And may God make it so. Amen.